I say, President Roy, that's the best introduction I've ever had, mercifully brief. Thank you so much. Your Excellency, each of you distinguished ladies and gentlemen, first of all, allow me to thank you for this kind invitation to be with you here this evening. It is, as has been said, my very first visit to the Cayman Islands, and I'm very happy that it's appropriately being sponsored by the University College of the Cayman Islands. And I want to say how much I appreciate that invitation, Madam Chairman of the Board, President Roy, and dare I say it, I don't know if he will object, my former student, Dr. Livingston Smith, for his role in this invitation. Maybe I shouldn't begin to mention my former students, because if I were to ask each to raise their hands, well, there's one over there, and Attorney General. Good to see you all. It's really wonderful that one is able to reconnect and to see how much you have been contributing to the Cayman Islands and, of course, to other areas that you have been over the years. I'm particularly gratified that you've asked me to share with you thoughts on the topic, political corruption in the Caribbean, where to from here. And I want to congratulate the university again for choosing that particular topic, because a university, as has been explained, is not only a location for teaching and research, it is also an institution designed to foster critical thinking and, of course, to speak about policy-relevant issues. It is quite obvious from the turnout this evening that each of you believes that this is a very important subject, as I do, and that we ought to explore it together in this forum, because there's not a day that passes in the Caribbean when in some restaurant or bar, a place of relaxation, people are not talking about issues related to corruption. And in fact, it would interest you to know that the British Broadcasting Corporation undertook a study, and they found that in the year 2010-2011, corruption was the most talked about issue around the world. So we here interested in this subject across the Caribbean, we are like so many others in the global community who have a considerable concern with this issue. Of course, we're not only here to talk about it, we're here to see in what way we may impact in a positive way a corruption-free Caribbean, the theme of the conference being convened in March 2014. It would be well in a university context to begin with a working definition of what we mean by political corruption. I see many students here with pen and paper. Don't take everything I say. I usually tell my students, don't try and write down everything I say, just take the main points. I suggest a working definition. The use or misuse of entrusted political power and authority for illicit gains, whether gains on the part of the particular individual concerned or their political organization or their family connections, but the use or misuse of entrusted authority for illicit gain more often than not at the expense of the public interest. This, as you can well imagine, is not only a reality in the Caribbean, and therefore I think it would be useful to begin our conversation by placing the Caribbean experience in a global context. What are some of the most recent findings? First of all, relating to the perception of corruption in general and political corruption in particular. Each year, There's a publication called the Global Corruption Barometer, and that publication you can access online, and I would suggest that it would be very useful, those of you who are deeply interested in this issue, to access that particular annual publication. The report of 2010-2011 surveyed over 100,000 people in 100 countries across the world. And that report found that in most countries, the people perceived amongst many public and social institutions, they perceived the political party as the institution most affected by corruption. 100,000 people across 100 countries. This was the people's perception in countries as far different as Argentina and Australia, as far different as Brazil and Canada, India and Ireland, and even, somewhat surprisingly, the United Kingdom and the United States. Of the various institutions, the judges, the courts, the media, the party came out in most countries as that which people perceived to be most impacted by corruption. Secondly, the Corruption Perception Index of 2011, an index that's published each year by Transparency International, found that over 3/4 of the world's states scored less than 5 on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 was perceived to be the most corrupt and 10 the most clean. 3/4 of the countries, 190 odd, scored under 5. But you say, well, that's perception. Regrettably, I have to report that perception is closely tracked by reality. The United Nations estimated that in 2011, corruption prevented 30%, 30%, of all development assistance from reaching its final destination. This means, ladies and gentlemen, in effect, that for every $1 million or £1 million of aid, development assistance, to build clinics, to equip hospitals, to provide roads, to expand water supplies in developing countries, most of all, to repair damage from hurricanes, almost 30%, 300,000 out of every million, found itself into pockets of public officials and private sector individuals to whom it was not intended. The most recent example, regrettably, in Uganda, much help has been targeted to deal with the war-ravaged areas of that country through the office of the Prime Minister in Uganda. And just a few weeks ago, it was exposed that a great deal of that assistance was not reaching the war-ravaged torn areas, nor to the persons in those areas, but was lining the pockets of public officials, and arising from that, the Irish government is reported to have indicated that it will no longer be providing aid through the Office of the Prime Minister of Uganda, but shall continue to help civil society organizations which are ensuring that what aid is given reaches the target for which it was intended. On another level of this reality that we're exploring outside of the Caribbean, the World Bank Institute in 2004-2005 estimated, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, that 1 trillion United States dollars, was paid in bribes during that year from private sector to public sector functionaries across the globe. From time to time, we glimpse the tip of the iceberg when prominent companies, very often held up as examples of integrity, when they themselves plead guilty and pay fines for corrupt conduct. I can think immediately of the German firm Siemens. Between 1998 and 2007, that firm paid $1.4 billion to illicitly influence government officials in Asia, Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas, and agreed, as a result, to pay fines of $1.6 billion when found guilty of this particular endeavor. Lest we believe that this is everywhere else but the Caribbean, in 2009, the first serious prosecution by the United Kingdom Serious Fraud Office, SFO, was of the bridge building firm Mabey and Johnson. And Mabey and Johnson pleaded guilty to bribing public officials in Iraq, in Ghana, and in Jamaica. And in restitution, Mabey and Johnson paid £6.6 million and some reparation to the Jamaican authorities. So this is not a public sector phenomenon. Too often, the World Bank, I have some difficulties with their definition of corruption as the misuse of entrusted public power for private purposes. That excludes the private sector in a way that does not fit reality. The impact of political corruption has been well described by the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan. And I want to quote from Kofi Annan's remarks as follows. Corruption is an insidious plague that has a wide range of corrosive effects on societies. It undermines democracy and the rule of law, leads to violations of human rights, distorts markets, erodes the quality of life, and allows organized crime, terrorism, and other threats to human activity, human security, to flourish. End of quotes. Lest we believe that Kofi Annan was speaking only about small or developing countries, I quote further. This evil phenomenon is found in all countries, big and small, rich and poor, but it is in the developing world that its effects are most destructive. End of quotes. Annan continued, and here I ask you to note these remarks particularly. Corruption hurts the poor disproportionately. By diverting funds intended for development, undermining a government's ability to provide basic services, feeding inequality and injustice, and discouraging foreign aid and investment. Corruption is a key element in economic underperformance and a major obstacle to poverty, alleviation, and development. End of quotes. So much has this been understood to be a scourge in the international community that the countries of the Western Hemisphere came together and signed the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption in the late 1990s, and thereafter, the entire global community developed the United Nations Convention Against Corruption in 2005. And many Caribbean states have signed on to that UN Convention Against Corruption, And I would be interested to know whether the United Kingdom has signed up on behalf of its overseas territories. On my last check, I do not believe that the Cayman Islands have been included on behalf of that the UK has signed on behalf of its overseas territories, including Cayman, but I am subject to correction there. So, this is the global context. How does the Caribbean fit in? In the first place, Caribbean people, in survey after survey, done at the University of the West Indies, done by other institutions, confirm that they perceive corruption in general and political corruption in particular as one of the main things wrong with the Caribbean. Each of us need to recall and cherish all the things that are right. The fact, for example, that countries in the Caribbean, more often than not, when it comes to important indicators of governance, such as freedom of the press, many of our states score higher in the global ratings than the United Kingdom, the United States, and even Canada. So there's much to be proud of in our tradition and in our governance arrangements. But we are ashamed and concerned at the level of corruption that we perceive. More often than not, the surveys in the Caribbean indicate that we have least confidence in political parties and in politicians amongst the institutions assessed in terms of the level of people's trust and people's confidence. The last survey done in relation to Jamaica, for example, found that while the parties and the parliament were very low down, very high up in terms of people's trust and confidence was the media. And that places a particularly heavy responsibility on those involved in the media not to betray that trust and confidence, but rather to reinforce it by providing the levels of information and investigation that people rightly expect from their media institutions. Take a look, if you can, at the Latin American Public Opinion Project, acronym LAPOP 2010. Again, this is online, and that is a boon not only to our students, but to everybody else who is interested in public affairs, that there are so many of these very important publications that can be accessed online, and this is one. This particular study, entitled The Political Culture of Democracy Across Latin America and the Caribbean, found that in the 26 countries surveyed, Vanderbilt University was very much involved in this project, the people of Trinidad and Tobago and of Jamaica perceived their countries to be the most corrupt of those 26, with Guyana not far behind. As you know, in election after election, in the last 20-odd years across this region, corruption scandals have been significant. And our people, in one territory after another, have punished governments, have removed them, when they are regarded as being either tainted by corruption or involved in corrupt practices. They have replaced those governments by opposition parties, which trumpet their integrity, only, ladies and gentlemen, to have the cycle repeated. That those who came in on the basis of their integrity repeat some of the same malpractices of those who were there before, and the cycle continues. And the people become more and more tired, more and more frustrated, and more discontented with how democratic governance is practiced. This perception of our people internally of ourselves is little different from our citizens, how our countries are perceived externally. Over the last 5 years, only 3 CARICOM states, Barbados, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent, have consistently scored over 5 on that scale that we talked about earlier on, the Corruption Perception Index, on 1 to 10, only 3. I should say, however, in the interest of balance, that we should note some good news. The LAPOP 2010 publication, to which I referred you, measured not only people's perception of corruption in the region, but also their reported experiences of involvement in forms of corruption like bribery or attempted bribery of police officers, government employees, local government officials, and so on. The so-called measure of what is called corruption victimization, which is different from corruption perception. The good news is that only 8% of Jamaica's population and 9% of Trinidad and Tobago's reported involvement in bribery at that level, sometimes misguidedly termed petty bribery. This is amongst the lowest of the Latin American and Caribbean countries. Belize and Guyana are at the midpoint with 17%, and Haiti experienced the highest levels of corruption victimization, measuring 54%. It should be noted that Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago's experience of corruption victimization is 3 times lower than the global average. Global surveys that have been done establish corruption victimization. 1 out of every 4 persons in the world report involvement in corruption victimization. How can we explain this gap between high levels of perception and low reported corruption victimization? I suggest, first of all, that the media spotlights and exposes allegations as well as evidence of corruption, and this gives that a prominence in people's awareness beyond their own personal experience of corrupt action and of corrupt relationships. Secondly, there appears to be some reduction of the incentives to pay bribes in many of our states as public agencies increase their efficiencies, cutting down on red tape, cutting down on bureaucracy, cutting down on delays, and thereby removing to some extent the incentive to pay money or to grease a palm in order to get some license or some certificate. And of course, certainly in Jamaica, one reason why corruption victimization has declined is the increased assertiveness and aggressiveness of the anti-corruption branch of our constabulary force, where in the last year or two, over 200 officers have been separated, either disciplined or arrested and prosecuted on grounds of corruption. A small but very important step. I remember a study I did in the 1999 to 2003, only 5 officers in those 5 years were separated on grounds of corruption. In 1 year alone, over 200. A step is being taken, and I think that this would discourage drivers from offering to pay a bribe because they are stopped for speeding, and also ensure that police officers would think twice, 3 times before requiring that to let somebody off. But I believe that perhaps the most important reason why there is this apparent gap between levels of perception and the reality of victimization is that while the man in the street's involvement in corruption may be declining, ladies and gentlemen, I regret to say, corruption in high places, amongst the untouchables, is becoming more endemic across the region. And in our small societies, people see and hear what is going on. It may not reach the evidential value in a court of law, but they hear and they see. And what they hear and see is that big fish are getting away metaphorically with murder, and sometimes literally. This is not just a Caribbean phenomenon. Amongst the 38 developed countries who have signed the OECD Convention against bribery of foreign public officials, in the latest review, only a few are judged to be applying the convention seriously. In too many CARICOM states, there's prima facie evidence pointing to a number of things. One, irregular procurement procedures. Persons getting contracts, development approvals, permits without the necessary competitive tender. Bribery payments, as well as kickbacks and improper expenditure of public funds. Yet there is little or no successful investigation, little or no successful prosecution and conviction of persons in high places. Ask yourselves, when last has there been a prosecution or conviction for illicit enrichment? It's an offense set out in the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and those who have ratified that convention are required to pass domestic legislation to criminalize illicit enrichment, defined very simply as a style of life and a possession of assets beyond the known legal sources of income of the particular public official. You drive all over Jamaica, other territories in the Caribbean, and you say to yourself, as our people say to themselves, how come this guy works as a modestly paid customs official? That one is a modestly paid officer in the constabulary force. This one is a politician whose salary we know and who often complains about how low it is. How does that square with the palatial residences and the lavish style of life? And that is the definition of illicit enrichment. But in Jamaica, in 10 or 12 years since we passed the Corruption Prevention Act, I remember very clearly, I was in the Senate at the time, I believe that there have been 2 prosecutions for illicit enrichment. How many Auditor General's reports have there been exposing irregularities year after year and proposing corrective measures year after year? How many have been followed by implementation of the recommendations or punishment of those perennially guilty of these irregularities and improprieties? I spoke to some of the auditors, public auditors today, and from their response to what I was saying, it seems to me that they know better than you or I that very, very few recommendations have been implemented, to say nothing of people punished for this gross abuse of public trust and misuse of public funds. There can be no question, therefore, that across our region, radical reforms are urgently required to build institutional capacity, to strengthen anti-corruption laws and anti-corruption institutions and integrity-building activity. The consequences, I suggest, of continued failure in these regards are grave and serious. First of all, the consequence in regard to economic growth, the increase of levels of poverty and in the intensification of the burdens on the backs of the poor who suffer the most, as Kofi Annan pointed out, when scarce resources are diverted from building more schools, from equipping the clinics better, for making sure the roads are properly repaired, diverted from those targets into the pockets of the corrupt. It is the World Bank which provides us with an interesting estimation of the cost of corruption. Let me quote from their study. Countries that improve or control corruption and the rule of law can expect an average in the long run of a four-fold increase in income per capita. Four-fold increase. Business grows. On average, it can make a difference of about 3% per year in annual growth for the enterprise. The difference can be between 2 to 4% per annum, the World Bank tells us, in the country's annual growth rate, between countries with a different extent of corruption control. One study of foreign direct investment estimates that corruption is equivalent to a 20% tax on foreign investors. Corruption and bribery, the World Bank concludes, is a regressive tax, end of quotes. All people's demand for a better life is therefore a cry, even when they themselves do not realize it, for less corruption. Let me be very specific and concrete. Our working people, particularly our young people, today are severely disadvantaged and very frustrated by the levels of unemployment, the difficulty in finding decent work. Every day, the university graduates whom I have had the privilege to teach and to interact with will be sending resume after resume to different entities. Trained professionals send out requests for jobs. The jobs are not there. And therefore, our youngsters contemplate, more than any other region in the world, migration. And indeed, much of our tertiary education constitutes a hidden subsidy to the United States, the United Kingdom, and other developed countries. More jobs, ladies and gentlemen, more decent work, requires more investment from local as well as foreign business. And more investment requires dealing with the most problematic factors facing investors. And if you look at the Global Competitiveness Report 2012-2013, just published a few days ago, you will see, for example, that in a country like Jamaica, of the 16 most problematic factors facing business and investors, corruption is in the top 3. So the link is clear. More jobs equals more investment, equals less corruption. It is a matter, therefore, not only important as it is of morality and ethics, but it is also a matter of economic frustration and economic hardship. A second serious consequence of continued failure to come to grips with this cancer is the undermining of confidence in institutions fundamental to modern democracy and the growth of dissatisfaction with the performance of democracy in the region. No wonder that in the 2010 LAPUP survey, to which I referred, the proportion of citizens whose values and attitudes support stable democracy in some of our countries and who are contemplating authoritarian solutions, support for stable democracy declining, support for authoritarian solutions increasing. Urgent measures are required. Measures which require the support and assistance of our international partners, both to develop a deeper understanding of the dynamics of corruption across the region, and alongside that deeper understanding, to design as well as to implement practical measures to build integrity and to combat corruption more effectively. May I suggest some of the steps that are required? 1, I believe it would be very helpful if each of our countries, the overseas territories, as well as the independent states, were to commission from institutions such as this rapid corruption assessments. It's a particular methodology which we used in Jamaica in 2008. I was part of a 3-person team that did that assessment to see the extent to which, in an impartial, considered, objective way, corruption constitutes a major issue in the particular territory. Alternatively, the Transparency International has developed a methodology called a National Integrity System Study, where you look at each of the institutions, the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, the audit institutions, to see the extent of integrity in each of those. I have done 3 of those studies, one for Jamaica, another for the Eastern Caribbean countries like St. Lucia and St. Vincent, and including the Bahamas, and the most recent one for Turks and Caicos Islands in 2009. I certainly believe it would be well worth considering doing a similar study, a National Integrity System study, for Cayman Islands. There are in fact 70-odd countries that are in that methodology, including many European states. But this is not a question of Europeans telling us, third world people, what we should do. It's applied to European countries themselves, and I do want to urge a similar study for the Cayman Islands, especially in the context of such a large turnout indicating a concern with issues of corruption. Secondly, it is urgently needed that we plug 2 of the most serious gaps in our legislative anti-corruption framework. One in particular, adapting national statutes to deal with political party registration and campaign financing using the Organization of American States model legislation. Secondly, as is now the case in Jamaica, a serious discussion on the need to pass anti-gang statutes, not so much aimed at the youngsters in the streets, but aimed at those upstream, the professionals in politics, in business, who are the facilitators, very often hiding behind codes of conduct to carry out their nefarious deeds. We are seriously contemplating it, and we're looking very much at the American statutes, which have to do with corruption. Because whatever the warts in American democracy, and there are very many, it's often described as the best democracy that money can buy. You're not going to be able to win. You're not going to be able to win a seat in either house unless you have a deep pocket. But having said that, one thing with the American system is that they follow the money. And they follow the money up to and including the highest levels in both the private sector and the public sector. We are contemplating a statute of that kind in Jamaica. Let me say a word or 2 more about the urgency of law and regulations to deal effectively with the relationship between money, political parties, and elections. A few days ago, Jamaica's 2 parliamentary parties, the governing party and the opposition party, made public the fact that between them, they had spent approximately $1 billion Jamaican dollars from Party Central alone on the 2011 general election. And that's a step forward. Prior to this, we had to guess, we had to speculate. Now there are some audited documents telling us how much has been spent. No one, however, knows who gave, how much to each of these parties, what commercial or criminal interests might have given. Some would say out of interest in making democracy function better, but others would want to speculate that that volume of funding is designed to buy influence, to get development approvals, disregarding competitive tender and environmental impact assessments, which often are against development in certain areas. And we only know about that when the development takes place and people who have bought houses find that when there's a heavy downfall of rain, they are no longer in a house, but they are in a lake. And that could have been anticipated if the EIAs were taken into account when approvals were given. So how much of the money being given is to buy influence and even to buy protection from the reach of the law? This is not a far-fetched speculation. Earlier this year, in April, the Supreme Court of Turks and Caicos Islands issued a confiscation order in the case of Regina versus David Smith. And in that confiscation order, the court held that David Smith, the convicted Jamaican financial criminal and money launderer, now serving over 30 years in a Florida prison, gave $5 million to the Jamaica Labour Party and $2 million to the People's National Party, and in addition, tens of thousands of US dollars to individual candidates that Smith felt worthy of his largesse. The Jamaican people are entitled to ask, why was Smith not prosecuted in Jamaica? After all, the main victims were 6,000 Jamaicans who were fleeced of their hard-earned earnings, perhaps spending those earnings foolishly. Anybody who believes you can legitimately get 10% interest on any investment every month, one might be wicked to say deserves to be fleeced. But that is another matter. Smith was not prosecuted in Jamaica. He was indicted, tried and convicted for accumulating over $220 million illicitly in stolen assets, but had to be prosecuted in South Florida and Turks and Caicos Islands. We have to ask, is the absence of investigation and prosecution related to the magnitude of electioneering and political contributions which remain a dark secret in our jurisdictions because there's absolutely no requirement for campaign finance disclosure? We should not need to speculate. The point is that we should have campaign finance regulation and law that should provide for disclosure of big donors, who gives how much to which party, and should ban, prohibit organizations, unregulated financial organizations like OLINT, from giving money to political parties and to fund election campaigns. The longer, ladies and gentlemen, that we take to plug this and similar loopholes, is the more people shall lose confidence in the rule of law, in the justice system, and ultimately in democratic governance. Scientific work across the region is revealing this as a clear and present danger. Popular disillusionment with critical institutions grows. And I refer not only to political parties. Please look at the findings of another study of 7 Caribbean territories. done by the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, published in 2012, Human Development Report on Citizen Security in the Caribbean, and they looked at 7 different countries. One of the most serious findings of that study is that across these 7 countries, almost 50% of the people believe that the justice system is corrupt. We're not talking about political parties now. We're talking about almost the last bastion. That institution which needs to be like Caesar's wife, above reproach. 50% believe that the justice system is corrupt. From a high of 70% in Trinidad and Tobago to a low of 34% in Barbados. Relatedly, connected to that, across these 7 states, 52% of the people believe that politically connected criminals go free, and 47% that powerful criminals, in the private sector primarily, with money and contacts, they also go free. Please excuse me if I relate this to the fact that Jamaica, in the 50 years since independence, being celebrated this year, 1 minister of government has been convicted for corruption. In the 10 years before independence, 3 were investigated, tried, and incarcerated. And permit me, if I also refer to the fact that right here in the Cayman Islands, the 2012 United States Department International Narcotics Control Strategy Report, the INCSR, International Narcotics Control Strategy Report, published every year and again accessible online. That report tells us, and here I quote, the number of prosecutions and convictions in the Cayman Islands is extremely low, given the vast scale of the country's financial sector. Only 6 successful prosecutions for money laundering and only 1 conviction in the last 4 years. End of quotes. 2012 INCSR. Let me be blunt. It cannot be right that any citizen of the Caribbean, anyone, can, with the click of a mouse, know who gave the most money to Romney's campaign. A man by the name of Sheldon Adelson, the owner of the Las Vegas Sands Casino empire. He was the biggest donor, and that's not because I am in. Certainly not on Romney's campaign. That you can access by simply going on the website of the Federal Elections Commission of the United States. And by carrying out the same exercise, I know that Jeffrey Katzenberg, the Hollywood film producer and chief executive of DreamWorks Animation, was the #1 contributor to Obama's campaign. Any of us can know that about the United States. Any of us in this room can know that in the 3rd quarter of 2012, who were the biggest contributors to the British Labour Party and to the British Conservative Party. In the case of the Labour Party, Michael Farmer was the biggest donor in the 3rd quarter of 2012. In the case of the Labour Party, the Union and Shop and Distributive and Allied Workers was the biggest contributor to the British Labour Party. The first man was to the Conservative Party. But none of us here in a parliamentary democratic system can know who is paying the piper, and thereby well positioned to call the tune. Not in Jamaica, not in Trinidad, not in Barbados, not in Guyana, and of course, not in Cayman Islands. We therefore need legislation urgently to plug the loophole, to turn the searchlight on the dark recesses of campaign finance and political party contributions. But we also need more than that. We need the enforcement of existing law in every single territory in the Caribbean. There is a law, the election law, criminalizes vote buying. May you put up your hand, those who are aware of the last time in which territory anybody has been tried or convicted for vote buying in the Caribbean. I see no hands, and the reason is clear. This happens almost as if it's a matter of course. It's in violation of our electoral statutes, and what that does is bring the law into disrepute if it is not enforced. And don't tell me that it's not possible. Our constabulary force in Jamaica, to their credit, carry out sting operations to identify who are giving and receiving bribes in the case of police. Is that not possible? In terms of identifying and making an example of the vote buyers. So we need not only new legislation, we need to enforce the existing one. In addition to new legislation to deal with the levels of political corruption, real and perceived, we need to establish where they do not exist and to strengthen where they do investigative watchdog agencies, along the lines of Jamaica's Office of the Contractor General, but with powers that go beyond investigation. Give them the financial and human resources to arrest and to prosecute, of course with appropriate constitutional and judicial safeguards against the abuse of power. Too often, ladies and gentlemen, anti-corruption institutions, particularly the commissions. In Jamaica, we have the Parliament Integrity of Members Commission, we have the Corruption Prevention Commission, we have the Office of the Contractor General. Too often, to use Greg Christie, my good friend's words, these commissions, including his own Office of the Contractor General, are toothless bulldogs, quote unquote. Of course, you will immediately add, and I agree with you, that's better to have a toothless bulldog than a toothless poodle. Because the bulldog barks loud. But what is even better is to have a bulldog that can not only bark, but also bite. And there are some very good examples of this. In Sierra Leone, prior to 2007, they had a toothless bulldog, the Sierra Leone Anti-Corruption Commission. The people felt that this was completely inadequate. They demanded more. And after 2007, the Constitution and the law was amended to give the Sierra Leone Anti-Corruption Commission powers to prosecute. And whereas before 2007, there were 3 prosecutions because it had to go through other agencies. Since 2007, there have been 70. And in that 70, 3 ministers since 2007 investigated, brought before the courts, and convicted. When I was in Brazil a few weeks ago at the International Anti-Corruption Conference, I sat and talked with the Anti-Corruption Commissioner in Sierra Leone, a gentleman by the name of Joseph Camaro. And he happily accepted my invitation to visit Jamaica to talk about their experience. Perhaps a challenge to Livingston and others, since Jamaica is so close to Cayman, maybe we can have Camaro come over here and talk about his experience in getting an anti-corruption commission. Finally, as the United Nations Convention Against Corruption recommends, the encouragement and facilitation of public and civil society engagement in the combat of corruption through public education campaigns aimed at raising the levels of public understanding, raising the levels of public integrity, and encouraging the reporting of corruption is an extremely significant tool in the building of integrity. In Jamaica, we have 1-800-CORRUPT, established by the Constabulary Force, and our National Integrity Action, we also have a hotline, and people are beginning to call in. It's a very good start, which needs to be reinforced and established more widely. Let us be clear, the man in the street, informed, facilitated, and empowered, is critical to advancing the combat of corruption. If we look at those countries that have been more successful than others, Hong Kong, Singapore, Sierra Leone most recently, most of the reports investigated by the anti-corruption commissions come not from employed investigator, but from the man in the street calling in. And by the way, in Hong Kong and Singapore, most of the reports that have been found to be valid relate to the private sector, not to the public sector. Alongside that is the key importance of our whistleblower legislation. Those who blow the whistle must know that they are protected against victimization of those who employ them. And that is one piece of legislation which is now on the statute books in Jamaica. It needs to be strengthened, but it is there. We are completing the first year of the NGO, the civil society organization which I head, the National Integrity Action, set up to strengthen the role of the people in building integrity and in combating corruption, ultimately to become a chapter of Transparency International, one of the 90-odd chapters around the world in different countries. We are finding and we are learning in this 1 year what others are experiencing who are more established in this area. That the foundation of combating political corruption lies in strengthening public awareness of the costs of corruption to the man in the street. Cost in terms of investments lost, cost in terms of more decent jobs not being available, cost in terms of economic stagnation instead of economic growth. We're also finding that there are persons in positions of authority, political persons, ministers, political and in the public sector more generally, who share our concerns in combating corruption and in building integrity, with whom we can speak, we can lobby and win support for passing legislation and enforcing laws sometimes against the corrupt in their own ranks. It is a mistake, I believe, as some civil society groups tend to have a broad-brushed approach, that all politicians are corrupt. Not so. Our experience is that there are many of integrity, but we need to give them encouragement, those of integrity, to stand up against those who are corrupt, who sometimes sit alongside them in cabinet and on the executives of the political parties. We are learning that to advance the struggle against political corruption and to challenge the impunity of the corrupt requires, in addition to building public demand, it requires enhancing professional will and institutional capacity. Professional will amongst our investigators, amongst our auditors, amongst our prosecutors and our judges, and that's one of our activities for the last year, to help training programs to enhance their will and their capacity. Very importantly, National Integrity Action in Jamaica is learning from experience that we have to carry the message directly to the people in town hall meetings, in forums like this. So you're not just talking on the radio or issuing a press release or doing advertisements, however good those are, but you need to engage the people face to face. And in so doing, to motivate and mobilize them, as well as our international partners. They need to do more to ensure that their citizens' taxpayers' monies, which ultimately forms the basis of grant and loan money, their citizens in the UK, in Europe, in the US, under immense pressure. Our partners need to ensure that the money from their citizens under so much pressure reaches the target. They need to say to our governments, we want to help your people, but you need to establish beyond reasonable doubt that the funding that we are making available does not end up in the pockets of public officials and private contractors who do not deserve it, because our people cannot afford it and your people need to get that funding where it is supposed to go. And so I conclude. Where from here? Number one, build public awareness and demand to combat corruption. Motivate, mobilize the people. Number two, strengthen institutional capacity. Redesign anti-corruption institutions which are ineffective to make them more effective. Number three, enhance the integrity of public officials. Give them encouragement, because there are three things that matter: the social will or public demand, the professional will of those who are involved in the justice system and allied, and the political will. But the political will only be strengthened if the public demand and the professional will is stronger than it has been. Most of all, ladies and gentlemen, when we look around the world, we see in so many countries the demand of the people, the professionals in public life, emboldening weak political will to challenge the impunity of the corrupt. In Brazil, where I just returned, the Supreme Court, for the first time in the history of Brazil, many decades, just convicted for corruption three of the most powerful political figures in that country. One of them, José Dirceu, was perhaps the most powerful minister in President Lula's cabinet. And it was expected that he would be Lula's successor until this corruption case developed. Lula's successor, President Dilma Rousseff, who opened the conference I attended, she fired 6 ministers in her first year for corruption. So the Brazilian people and authorities are waking up. Moving across to Asia, in the Philippines, ex-President Gloria Arroyo has been arrested for corruption, for fraudulently transferring money from a Philippines charity to purposes for which it was not intended. In India, in February of this year, the Supreme Court of India canceled 122 telecoms licenses sold below market prices in 2008. The government auditor estimates that in 2010, the government of India lost $35 billion by not using the auction to sell those licenses. The Supreme Court found that this was arbitrary, capricious, and contrary to the public interest. Judges were not afraid to turn back that act of corruption which cost the Indian people so much. Moving to Europe, Italy's 4-time Prime Minister, Silvio Berlusconi, tried, convicted, and sentenced to jail for 4 years for tax fraud. In the United Kingdom in February, the authorities arrested 8 previous untouchables from the Murdoch newspaper empire of bribing public officials. In Africa, in Nigeria, the case of James Iburi, very interesting, former governor of one of Nigeria's oil-rich states, under investigation by Nigeria's Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. But the investigation leads nowhere, no prosecution. Iburi, in May 2010, was arrested in Dubai at the request of the United Kingdom authorities, extradited, tried, and the former governor of this oil-rich Nigerian state is now serving time at Her Majesty's pleasure in a prison in the United Kingdom. I mention these cases to illustrate that we in the Caribbean are not the only ones bearing the burden of the cost of corruption. Sooner or later, other peoples are demanding that that burden be lifted, and that those who have enjoyed impunity must no longer do so. And they are getting action from the authorities, as I've indicated. May I suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that we here in the Caribbean, we need to do likewise. And sooner, more than later, we need to get action, more effective action, against corruption and in building integrity. Thank you very much.